Like when my winter coat gets away from All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started on the tour today. Real quick, we have Landon here from UNC, who's a photographer. I just wanted to ask everyone, okay, is it okay if he takes pictures? And it's okay to say no, just let me know by hand if you're okay to be photographed.
We're also pretty well disguised today.
Check your hair.
So we're going to start at this panel here, but before we do, just go over a couple rules and housekeeping things. We ask that you keep your mask on at all times. Try to socially distance from people that you're not, with. And during the tour and after the tour, we ask that you stay on the carriageway. Going through the cemetery can be a little dangerous in terms of going over grave depressions. What happened over time, some of the original caskets were made of wood, and over time they deteriorated and the earth fell into them. So we want to avoid any twisted ankles or holes or anything like that. With that then, welcome and thank you all for coming to Geer Cemetery, and welcome to In Plain Sight.
You're in the cemetery. Don't say too much. We good.
Yeah.
We got you. We got you in the cemetery.
So this first panel right here is introducing us to the history of Geer Cemetery. So, going all the way back to 1877 is when the cemetery was started, but Durham started as a city in 1869. So before that, Durham was really a couple of plantations, and it was just kind of a loose village around a train station. After the Civil War ended in 1865, there was no public burial space for African Americans in the city. Maplewood Cemetery was created in 1872, but as a cemetery for whites. So in 1877, 3 African American men, Willis Moore, John O'Daniel, and Nelson Mitchell, purchased a 2-acre lot from a white farmer and former slave owner, Jesse B. Geer. And that was the start of Geer Cemetery. At one point, the cemetery was called the City Cemetery, as well as the City Colored Cemetery. And the cemetery was active from about 1877 to 1945. Now, the North Carolina public death record started in 1909, so you can see in this graph here, before that, there's not a lot of records of deaths that were recorded here. That's why it looks like it shoots up at one point, but from the death certificates that we were able to find, we know that about 1,600 people were buried in Geer Cemetery. So we estimate that it's potentially 2,000 upwards of people that have been buried in the cemetery. At one point, the cemetery had to shut down because it was getting overcrowded. There are reports of people being buried on top of one another. And we'll get into what sort of happened around that time in a panel on the other side about the care and the upkeep and what happened in terms of the decline of the cemetery. So let's go over this one. Oh, thank you so much. I might need that. Yeah, you can't go through this. Here on this panel, Out of Slavery, we highlight some of the stories of African Americans from slavery to freedom and what that was like. After the Civil War ended, many freed African Americans moved to settle in Durham from plantations like Stagville, Cameron Village, Lipscomb Plantation, not Cameron Village, excuse me, Cameron Plantation, and Lipscomb Plantation. If you'll notice in the cemetery, not all the grave markers are even, of course, and originally some of the graves were marked with wooden monuments, crosses, or planks and inscriptions. As is often the case in African American cemeteries, graves were marked with a number of materials. And also, in different African American cemeteries, you'll notice different things. I should have mentioned this in the beginning. Make sure that you don't touch anything, that you leave things as they are. Some things might look unfamiliar, like plates or candles or things like that, to venerate a certain person. Also, we ask, don't touch any stones or anything like that, even if it looks like trash or something. It could still be a piece of a broken monument. Speaking on the tombstones, during the 1910s and 20s, stones were popular in Geer Cemetery and in African American cemeteries throughout North and South Carolina. Until recently, the origin of these markers was a mystery, but by recent research, Friends of Geer Cemetery volunteers have traced at least one of these stone markers to a maker in western South Carolina. They were available in a number of sizes, and the text and decoration could be selected by the purchaser. They have all the same rounded tops and the oatmeal texture, and they are very fragile. As many as 200 grave markers of stone and other durable materials remain today, but many, as you'll notice, have been toppled over. On this panel, we highlight the building of Black Durham. So, Black Durham was made of several prominent black neighborhoods, as shown on this map. The biggest one being Haiti, which was named after Haiti, which was actually spelled at the time the same, so it was reflecting. The country Haiti was spelled the same as Haiti, so it wasn't a misspelling or a misreference. Many African Americans made money at this time by different industries such as the tobacco industry, which was booming at the time, real estate, banking, insurance, and a number of entrepreneurial efforts. A couple of highlights on this panel.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
I will speak up.
I guess he's trying to hear you.
Are the Pearsons. The Pearsons were among Durham's first African American real estate family, and certainly one of the most successful. George and Cynthia Pearson started building their family before emancipation. George fought in the Union Army during the Civil War, and after the war they amassed a substantial amount of property along the southern edges of Durham, farming and raising a large family. This provided a foundation from which their children built remarkable careers in education, business, and the ministry. Their land holdings, meanwhile, proved crucial to the creation of African American communities and institutions in Durham. Long after George and Cynthia Pearson passed away in the early 20th century, we honor their legacy and their descendants through places like Pearson Town and W.G. Pearson School. The Pearson family plot is clearly seen right over here along the pathway.
That looks like a relatively new marker.
I'm familiar with
Some of them are, like, I believe we passed Margaret Closet, who we'll talk about over here.
Yeah.
That was a newer one. Yeah, founder of
White
White Rock.
Rock. Yeah.
Yep.
My church. Yeah. Looks like I grew up with her great granddaughter. Emma Jean Brown.
So speaking on Mrs. Fawcett. This is the panel highlighting the faith communities of Durham. So as Black Durham grew, the black churches grew. In 1890, there were 8 black churches, and by 1903 there were 14. Now, even within slavery, the black church has been the bedrock within the black community. It's been the meeting place, it's been the place from everything from spiritual relief and salvation to political fervor and inspiration. Many of Black Durham's pillars are laid to rest here in Geer Cemetery, such as Margaret Closet, the founder of White Rock Baptist Church. She started that church in 1866 as a small prayer circle with like minds and a humble rented room along the railroad tracks, and it grew to be one of the greatest institutions of the African American community. Another pillar of Black Durham buried here is Reverend Edian Markham, the founder of St. Joseph's AME Church. He was married to a woman who would join his missionary work and continue his legacy, Molly Walden Markham. Both contributed to the growth of the church Edian had founded, renamed St. Joseph AME in a magnificent new building raised in 1892. The Markhams are buried here, but their graves have not been identified yet.
Do you know where that house that Miss Fawcett had near the railroad tracks? Where was that? Wasn't it around here?
I'm not sure if
Before,
it had been demolished, but I think it was close. It was closer to the railroad tracks.
this up here or down by the current church? Do you know?
That I'm not too sure, and I can actually write it down. And we
No,
can.
that's
When I was
okay.
growing up, some of the Fawcettts and her family lived behind what is now the factory, Capital Broadcasting, Duke, the ballpark. They lived up the hill.
Cool.
So I can't say she stayed there, but I was in school with her, one of her relatives, descendants, and that's where they lived.
Over by the
Thank
ballpark.
you.
Okay.
Thank you.
It was on Willard Street. That was what the street was called. Name.
Okay.
Thank
Never
you.
need a railroad.
Yeah, it was on. Yeah.
Never need a railroad.
But of course
I'll jot that one down. And
Yeah,
then
I didn't think
Oh, no worries,
that
not
the
at all.
current church was near it.
And also, you can grab brochures here if you like to. There's a map included and a couple descriptions as well. Okay, I skipped over one, two,
So Mr. Goodloe's.
So my aunt had a saying. She always used to tell me that a dollar would pass over 7 times before it left Black Durham. Speaking to how money would circulate at the height of Black Durham, it stayed within the community for a long time. She always told me things like, at the height of the Depression, the white banks in Raleigh came to the black banks to borrow because they were still intact. Like farmers, mechanics and farmers, yes. This panel is highlighting the economic life of some of the movers and shakers, as well as the people who were working to ensure that Durham became the city that we know it today. Over here we have a highlight of Thomas Goodloe, who was born to Louise and Harriet Justice Goodloe, formerly enslaved at Stagville, but already property owners in Durham by the 1860s. He worked at the district superintendent for the renowned NC Mutual Life Insurance Company, founded by John Merrick, Aaron Moore, and Charles Spalding. Goodloe amassed a considerable amount of wealth, and eventually branching out into his own entrepreneurial effort, like Durham Elite Mattress and Upholstery Company, and his death at 43 was cut short his promising career. Here's another highlight of a woman named Julia Sellers, who was on her certificate was labeled domestic, but that's oftentimes a broad category of anyone or any woman who was working at home was just labeled domestic. Tying to another panel about two down, this speaks to quote unquote the invisible labor that oftentimes upheld the community, that we don't often highlight as much, but we'll highlight here. Now, at the turn of the century, public education was a relatively new idea, even for white America. The black community knew the power of education and ensured that money was spent into building institutions and schools to extend legacies and make sure that future generations had opportunities. One family highlighted on this panel is the Whitted family. They formed a dynasty in the early African American education of Durham, and William O. Whitted became one of the instructors at the school founded by and named for his late brother James. Their sister Louise Whitted Burton and several of James's daughters became public school teachers. Among that younger generation, Pearl Whitted moved from secondary to higher education, serving as a registrar of James Shepherd's National Religious Training School, later to become NC Central University. William, Pearl, and several other members of the larger Whitted family are buried here in Geer Cemetery, but their grave markers are not found.
There's a lot of serious cleanup to go on. Take care of those vines.
Yeah, it's been much worse in a few years past.
I remember seeing pictures of it just
Covered. All this was
All the
covered.
trees.
This
That's
wasn't
awesome.
clear
Oh, that did come out well.
last year at all.
oh wow.
Yeah. On this panel,
Awesome.
we highlight some of the invisible labor that I was talking about a minute ago. Some of these people worked for families like the Dukes, and highlighted here is W.H. Sheeran, who was Washington Duke's driver. Excuse me, Albert, picking up the wrong one. Albert Armstrong. Not listed on this panel, but a laborer that we highlighted at an event prior was Rufus Purefoy. His tombstone is on the other side. We had an event in 2019 cleaning it and erecting it and highlighting him. And a couple of notes about him. He was the chauffeur of Charles Knoll, an executive for American Tobacco. Purefoy lived with his family on Matthew Street in a neighborhood of laborer homes that once stood next to the American Tobacco Factory. He had a tragic demise. On July 4th, 1930, he got into an argument with a neighbor and a close friend, Tom Black, and that ended in a shootout. Both men shot each other multiple times. Black also worked in a service for Mr. Satterfield, a tobacco exporter. Purefoy shares, it's a double headstone with his father. It's white marble and hand-worked. It's a type of headstone that's intended for married couples, but it's the place where his father, and I believe the mother and another relative are on the backside. So I think there's multiple family members buried near that tombstone.
So I showed you guys that that original.
Yeah.
This is her mom. I mean, this is who was buried over there.
That's the lady. Yeah.
Yeah, but her mom is here, and William Henry, he's here also. This is my great granddad. This young guy here, this little Jack, he married C.C. Spalding's daughter.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah, he married C.C. Spalding's daughter and went on to become president of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. In 1931, he saved the fraternity from going bankrupt because he was a banker. And so he understood, and he knew the banks were going down, so he told our treasurer to take everything out of the bank. And so we're the only fraternity that didn't go bankrupt. Because Jack knew the
And your mom's related to him.
So this is my great granddad. So my granddad wasn't born yet in this picture.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
my granddad was 7 years younger than him.
Gotcha.
And she actually grew up in a asylum. She she had we don't know what it was, but she had a condition, and in those days, no one knew how to handle them, so they sent the kids to asylums. Yeah. So, yeah.
Group, kind of a group
Right.
I wonder if that was in Oxford.
I don't know where it was. Yeah. But my granddad used to talk about her all the time. But yeah.
What do you do?
So I grew up with that picture.
You mean later on,
We're introduced to
somebody come through, how do you take this up?
If I wanted to come out and bring a family member in a week, would this be available?
Do you take it up?
It's still, it's the exhibit's running until March 7th. It's not, we're still in discussion about what's going to happen to the actual panels after the exhibit's up, but and there's still talks about even extending the dates of the exhibit past March 7th.
So how you preserve it from the weather?
Yeah, it's weatherproof. I'm not exactly sure the name of the material it is, but it's waterproof.
Snow tomorrow won't hurt.
Yeah, the snow was our first test for it. Because we came back yesterday and there's bits of ice and stuff, so it's not going to warp or anything. Thank you. Good question.
Family that come, they live out of town, and I'm just wondering.
Is it still going to be
It's
here?
going to be here, but they have to come before March. Okay, well, I don't know how that will.
Yep, it'll still be intact.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that.
I was like, I can't do it in the middle, but I'll wait. On ABC News there was a segment where Jessie, she was a member a while back, and she was talking to a reporter about the state of it, and it was a lot worse than it is now, but I just wanted to volunteer and lend a hand, and it's been amazing seeing what the group's done within 2 years. It's
Eustace?
Yeah.
That's who, okay.
Jessie Eustace.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem that big, but when you're trying to work
She did a great job getting everything started.
Oh, the Carolina Times.
Oh, this is the teenagers, and then
You get here and
you start
it's
pulling up Ivy and Lewis Austin.
Yeah, this is the panel I was talking about that kind of details what happened in terms of how did the cemetery get to the state it was. And I really like this first sentence here. African Americans were not negligent or passive in addressing the problem that was already evident with the cemetery. So as shown in some of the research here, people were trying to ask the city for help multiple times of, this problem with the cemetery. It wasn't a public cemetery. There was a board of trustees who were trying to maintain it. But with that sort of setup, the only way they really make money is when the burial plots are sold. So once all of them are sold, they don't have much more money to keep it up and keep it going. And it costs a lot of money to make sure that a cemetery will stay maintained. The city was really lifting their hands, and in fact, I believe in the 1920s, that's when the area started to populate with more white people in this area. So there's certainly pushback to extend acreage to this or help in any sort of way. In 1904, black leaders petitioned that the city help with Geer Cemetery, arguing for equal treatment and respect. They complained about things like vandalism that was happening in the cemetery and the forces of nature. degrading the cemetery, the city responded only by erecting a plank fence around the cemetery. Around 1915, John Merrick and Aaron Moore created a new public cemetery for African Americans on the south side town of Moline Avenue called Violet Park after Merrick's mother. Burials shifted from Geer to this new cemetery quickly, but by the 1920s, as I was saying, the white suburbs started to build up, and African Americans again asked for resources to maintain the cemetery, to create a city-owned and maintained cemetery for black people. White residents near Geer signed a petition asking the city not to enlarge the cemetery. At the time, the city was in the process of doubling the sizes of the all-white Maplewood Cemetery to a total of 120 acres. So money was going there and no funding coming here. Geer Cemetery contains fewer than 4 acres. I was trying to find the note about Violet, but what ended up happening with Violet Park, when that closed, they were trying to, I believe, move bodies out of the cemetery because they built a parking structure, I believe, there. And in this next panel, we'll talk about some of the activism where people were trying to step up and make sure that Geer Cemetery was taken care of.
So I have a question.
Yes.
What's the name of the cemetery on Moline Street?
Violet Park.
Violet Park.
Yeah.
Okay. That's right down the street.
They
though. That
changed
might
it,
have been.
though.
Yeah. They're not Violet. Violet Park. Violet Park. That would have been.
I never heard that name,
feasible.
Violet.
Feasible. Yeah, it was just a cemetery on Moline Street. But my feeling is if they live right down the street, you would think that might have been Violet Park.
Yeah.
They moved those graves.
As pictured here. Actually, the story with this tree is, I believe it fell in 2019. No, it didn't fall. It was cut by a nearby landowner, and it toppled over a couple of stones. I believe the reasoning for cutting it was that he was afraid it was going to fall, and it did, in a very bad direction. So that's why activism for Geer Cemetery is important.
Yes.
So in about the late 80s and 90s, there were city-funded cleanups by groups like TROSA, Keep Durham Beautiful, and City Public Works. But one of the driving forces of Friends of Geer Cemetery has been Robert Kelly Bryant.
He's a member of our church.
Oh. He was one of the founders of Friends of Geer Cemetery and one of the descendants of Geer Cemetery. And work has been done in terms of cleanups, research on burials, signage, the reclamation of the carriage road. When I joined Friends of Geer Cemetery, I should have given my intro at the beginning, but I joined in 2019. This was not clear at all. In fact, it was covered in ivy and vine. In the summertime, it was ripe with poison ivy. There's been a lot of work done within the 2 years that I've been here, and it's thanks to people who laid the foundation and made sure that noise was being made about the state of the cemetery. It's not at the perfect point where we would ideally want it to be, but it's getting there bit by bit. Thanks to Friends of Geer Cemetery.
How did you get interested?
I actually, I just moved back home in early 2019, and I was watching a segment on ABC News where Jesse Eustace was talking to a reporter about the state of the cemetery. I'd never heard of Geer Cemetery, and I was looking for groups to get involved with and help, and I showed up to a meeting, and here we are. And it's been really.
They roped you in.
They roped me in, and it's been quite amazing. Learning the history of Durham through Geer Cemetery's point of view of how many people contributed, and it breaks your heart when you think about, you know, all that time that this was going neglected. But now the stories are getting out, people are getting uplifted, so the work is being done, and that's been really rewarding to watch in the 2 years that I've been with the group.
And you say there's 2,000 graves here?
2,000 plus, we're not sure.
Yeah.
Actually, there's funding going towards an archaeological survey. That's why it's like, don't touch anything, because if they do the survey, that could alter the results. But if that survey gets done, then we'll know a lot more accurately how many people are buried here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then on this last panel down here,
Perfect day, right?
so lucky us.
Yeah.
I hope you have other shoes for the last tour.
Yeah. So Geer Cemetery is not a one-off. It's not an isolated incident of a cemetery, a black cemetery that has been neglected by a city or surrounding area. There are several different organizations across the South and the East where historic black cemeteries have been neglected, and groups have risen up to ensure that money is going towards cleanups, that stories are being told and researched, and the cemeteries are being rectified. There's a potential, if you check in your brochure, there's a link to the website for Durham in Plain Sight, and that's where you can find out about donations and joining Friends of Geer Cemetery and all the work that's going on, especially within Plain Sight and onward.
Yeah, we're circulated then.